Good evening. Welcome to the second ghost story that I have written of this period of isolation. This evening I shall be bringing you a story inspired by the 17th century. I've avoided too many specific references to avoid historical inaccuracy. So without further ado, I bring you the Dirge of the Marsh. The rain had fallen for months. A great deluge had turned the better part of the land into a great swamp. Those places already waterlogged had altogether disappeared under all that ran off and oozed out of bare and barren fields and hills, down stone gullies, off church roofs, and from the vile sludge of the towns and cities. It took till well into the spring for water to recede from the sludge pits, an estuarine area of marsh and reed bed, once used for sewage, now dredged and returned to nature. A pestilence had forced the populace into retreat, leaving many such wildernesses soulless save for the occasional fisherman. Jacob, a clerk, often took walks along this stretch of estuary, both to gather his thoughts and to take the air. He had not ventured so far all winter, on account of the seemingly interminable rain and wind. Now, at last, the sun shone, and the late March warmth began to dry the mud. How cruel it seemed that just as the air had cleared and become pleasant to breathe, so many were afflicted by sickness from that very same air. While people were permitted outside, though not in groups or for any forms of public assembly, fear compelled most to remain in their homes. Thus, on a clear morning in late March, Jacob left his modest house just beyond the city walls and set off along the river banks. Lack of use had begun to see some stretches become overgrown, what with new spring shoots. There is no doubt in my mind that Jacob's spirits were lifted by the verdant scenes unfolding before him as he walked. However, it's hard to take great cheer from solace like this, no matter how pretty the view ahead is, when one imagines the reason why the land is deserted. The new warmth rose from the land with the ever-brightening sun upon empty stretches of road and deserted fields. An eerie atmosphere unsettled Jacob, as not a figure stirred in the haze. Crows scattered into the air from still bare mature oak and ash, and rabbits darted amongst thorn bushes, but no human life stirred on Jacob's walk for the first hour or more. As he passed the second bridge, he spied some movement a little way downstream, where the river split between the more wooded channel and the reed beds. It seemed too large and purposeful to be anything other than a person. Tentatively approaching, as one does when recently lacking in human company, Jacob soon realized it was merely a fisherman. His face had been lined and tanned by a life of squinting and frowning over the bright reflections of the river. However, Jacob sensed a worry in his face. Somehow certain lines seemed to betray aspects of a person's life. These were old lines, of concern that had been etched in over many decades and continued to deepen even now. Jacob nodded to him and tipped his hat. The fisherman returned the gesture, albeit hesitantly. As Jacob turned on the left-hand path towards the sludge pits, the fisherman looked as if he was about to say something, but stopped, paused for a moment, and returned to fishing, lowering his straw hat to hide his face. Jacob continued, past the boathouse that stood empty, wooden vessels slowly rotting where they rested. The empty ship canal to his right and the river to his left, he walked along the track toward a stretch of woodland that extended between the two channels of water. The path stuck tightly to the bank of the canal, while to the left large oaks protruded from thick mud and pools of stagnant water. Beyond the trees, the river was visibly widening into the reed beds that rise up from the estuary. Eventually the path reached a point where the trees thinned out and the land to the left dropped away into the marsh. The sludge pits, wooden boards run as passages among the reeds, which stretch for several miles. They are only broken by trees erupting from the boggy ground, but these trees are long dead, since the estuary reclaimed this land. Instead, they stand as bleached husks, lifeless among the tall drifting strands of golden hair. Jacob stepped down onto the boardwalk, perhaps with trepidation, for he had not walked here since before the winter, before the pestilence. I suspect much of that was out of fear the boards had rotted, there being such a deluge over so many months. The boards appeared dry and without the dark bands and patches that might have signalled decay, but Jacob trod carefully nonetheless. He was a clerk, not a profession known for risk and adventure. In spite of the wider circumstances of life at the moment, Jacob felt a peaceful air wash over him. He had always come here to ease his mind, and somehow the unchanging desolation of these marshes brought great comfort. While certainly devoid of human life, the pits are home to an abundance of creatures, from the warblers that cling to the reeds and willow branches, to the snakes that writhe through the water searching for prey. Even if Jacob could not see these, he could most certainly hear them, along with a myriad of insects, humming up from the marsh as the sun warmed the shallow pools. Having not been here for a while, Jacob decided that he would venture further along the boardwalk than he normally did. Eventually, the path split in two, one heading back towards the ship canal and the dry wooded bank, while the other led further out into the estuary. An expanse of reeds unfolded before Jacob as he took the left-hand path into the estuary. The marsh widened to the point that any dry land seemed distant and shrouded by the tall golden strands that amassed around him. The patchy bog beneath the walkway was replaced by deeper and deeper water as the reeds started to thin. Just as Jacob thought of turning back, if any of the boards broke, he'd be in trouble this far out, he spied what looked like a small structure a little farther ahead. He decided to investigate, and sure enough the land started to rise under the boardwalk again. It seemed he was now on a small piece of dry land, probably once connected to the banks further back before brackish water claimed this area several centuries ago. In front was a dilapidated stone dwelling, barely a hut or home, but most definitely where someone had lived. A solitary crow perched atop the exposed chimney stack. Facing into the wind, its feathers ruffled, it remained unflinching with Jacob's approach. He did not enter the hut, but within yards of the entrance he recoiled, almost losing his balance from the boardwalk. Forced to cover his mouth and nose with a handkerchief, Jacob smelled something putrid and rotten. He could not identify what it was, but it evoked revulsion and dread in equal measure. There was nothing on earth, living or dead, he felt, that could emit such a stench. Relief. A breeze had picked up, and the smell was washed from the reeds and out into open water. Actually, perhaps breeze understates the strength of the gusts that began to rattle across the marsh. Jacob heard two things: the whistling sound as air funneled from the hollow reeds and in between the hut's crumbling stone blocks, and secondly, an eerie sound that was hard to place. At first a faint hum, indistinguishable from the wind, it slowly rose to sound a deep dirge, almost that of a viol or another stringed instrument. Its discordance and low resonant tone was assured but melancholy, deeply mournful in fact. Jacob had initially suspected it was drifting from an inn across the estuary, but it was too loud to be that far away, and the music was not contemporary. It seemed very old, perhaps older than these marshes. It grew louder and louder, as if the instrument was mere feet away, but he saw no one, heard no footsteps, neither on board nor through marsh. Jacob turned and walked briskly, his heeled shoes creating a purposeful and anxious rhythm on the boards as the dirge faded into the distance. He did not stop when he reached the more familiar part of the sludge pits, but kept going until he reached where the fisherman was sitting, further upstream. He nodded to the man and tried to conceal his anxiety, but he must have seen the sweat on Jacob's brow and the sharp dilation in his pupils. He raised his hat, gave a concerned glance, and followed Jacob with his eyes as he continued upstream. The river, the roads, and the city were nearly as quiet as they had been when Jacob left, save for a few people out doing essential errands. The poorest, the city's most destitute, could not afford to isolate themselves in the way that merchants, clergy, and the wealthy had done. They had no rural property to hide in while the pestilent tide swept the land. As such, there were a few sickly souls standing at street corners selling herbs or begging. But Jacob scarcely noticed these, his mind so perturbed by what he had seen, or rather not seen. The rest of his day was uneventful, busying himself with prayer and clerical work to maintain a semblance of routine. He blamed the whole matter on his isolation and on working too late by candlelight, so he took supper early and retired to bed. At first that night he slept deeply. Nothing, it seemed at first, could disturb his slumber. Then, it must have been around 2 a.m, Jacob awoke with a jolt. The breeze had blown in through an open window, not one Jacob remembered opening, and brought an indescribable putrid smell to his chamber. As he adjusted to the room and the pitch dark that consumed it, he heard but 2 sounds. The first, a familiar whistling sound, as if through rushes and stone blocks. The second, an equally familiar, but much more chilling sound. The rising discordance of strings, rising not in tone nor mood, but in volume, as once again the mournful tune grew nearer. Jacob felt all of a sudden paralysed and unable to breathe, as if he was drowning in the rising tide of dread carried by the music. Suddenly he found he could lash out, his limbs suddenly springing to life. He cried out into the black night, and in an instant the music had vanished as if it had never been there. Jacob's maid Sarah came rushing to see what the commotion had been, but Jacob assured her that he had merely suffered a bad dream. She blamed it on the rich food he had eaten for supper and returned to her room. Jacob knew that this had been no dream. The next morning he set out early, the mist not yet cleared from the weir just above the second bridge. He held such a great fear in his heart, and had almost decided against his walk, but something compelled, no demanded, that he investigate. Once again the land was deathly silent, save for the livestock and wild creatures that were slowly reclaiming the spaces left by the retreating populace. Soon he arrived upon where the fishermen usually sat, but this time found no one there. This unnerved Jacob, for he had been a comforting presence on his return walk the previous day. Nonetheless, he pressed on past the bridge, beyond the boathouse, and to where the oaks met the bog and the bog met the marsh. The sludge pits, no longer a source of peace or solace for Jacob, they now bore a foreboding atmosphere. Even more tentatively than the previous day, Jacob stepped out along the boardwalk. Initially he was greeted by the amicable flutter and chatter of the warblers, darting among reed and branch. However, soon he reached a point beyond which they would not fly, as the reeds thinned and the water deepened. It seemed an age, almost as interminable as the winter rains, but eventually Jacob had reached the crumbling hut, a vestige of drier land from a drier time, centuries before. He was regretful that there was no crow this time. While the bird was a sinister sentinel, normally a sign of warning or death, the very sight of any life in such a dead place might have brought some comfort. Jacob approached the entrance to the hut and passed under the lintel nervously. The room, now open to the sky, was almost empty. The only features Jacob could discern were a hearth, or traces of one in the middle of the room, and a pile of sticks in the corner. No, not sticks. Bones. Jacob recoiled and backed out of the room. As he did so, he pondered why the bones hadn't been buried. He pondered the implications that this must have for one's soul, for your remains to be left out here in the marsh. Just before he had completely left the ruin, he spied a small carving in the corner of the room. How unusual for there to be anything like this on a house clearly meant for someone barely more than a squatter, Jacob thought. The carving appeared to depict a small, twisted figure, contorted and mischievous, as so many old carvings are. He held a stringed instrument, an archaic form of viol, much like the sound Jacob had heard twice now. No sooner had he spied this than the breeze picked up once more, carrying the same stench out of the house and around Jacob. Then an almighty gust forced the air from his lungs, simultaneously removing the vile odour, but replacing it with something Jacob had grown to fear intensely. First came the sound of whistling through the reeds, then came the dirge, the deliberate, mournful sound of strings, ancient and unworldly, the song of death. Jacob was paralysed by panic. The sound was rising higher and higher to fill his being as it drew closer, like the tide swallowing up the estuary mud. Louder and louder, more discordant with every gust of wind, it was almost upon him. A hand clasped around his, and suddenly he was snapped out of paralysis. He turned and saw the fisherman, willing him, begging him to return to land. Could he hear this too, Jacob wondered. As they raced along, wasting no time, the dirge was still audible, but more prominent now was the strength of the wind on a morning that had been so calm. What's more, the sky had darkened and the rain started to fall. The fisherman's eyes were darting wildly up to the sky, to the left and right and behind, to check Jacob was still in tow, or perhaps to ensure that the hut was out of sight. They could now see the warblers darting among reeds just ahead, and the rise of the land a mere couple of 100 metres ahead. Jacob allowed himself relief at this sight for a mere fleeting moment. And then the stench was back, choking the air out of his lungs. Still running, now more panic than ever, his nightmare fulfilled, and a board gave way beneath him. He slipped into the water below, drawn down by the reeds and mud. The fisherman frantically tried to reach for him, but there was naught he could do. The water seemed to rise inexorably around Jacob, and so too did the sound of the dirge. The mournful music carried him under the waves, whipped up by the fierce gale, until he could hear nothing, nor even see anything in the dark and murky marsh. Then beneath him, he felt he was being dragged further by a cold hand. Pressed against him, held by the same hand, was the rotting bow of a stringed instrument. They never found Jacob's body, but a funeral was held. A lonely fisherman attended briefly, and due to the pestilence, few others were present. However, some heard the sound of a dirge as the mourners walked away from the church. The dirge of mourning for those never laid to rest, for those still wandering the marsh.